The white wedding dress dragged through the red dust of Montana, staining itself with the blood of the earth, as Abigail Foster ran without looking back. Her lungs burned with the dry desert air, and sweat ran down her face, mixing with tears of despair. Less than an hour ago, she had discovered the truth about her fiancé, the powerful cattle baron Maxwell Crawford, and this discovery had turned her wedding day into a race for survival. The words she had heard through the office door still echoed. In her mind, plans to massacre a Crow camp, forged documents about land rights, and her father's name mentioned in the midst of a sinister conspiracy. Crawford wasn't just the respected rancher everyone in Paradise Valley believed him to be. He was a man willing to start a war to expand his cattle empire. The harsh August sun beat down on her back as she moved further and further away from civilization. Abigail knew that her escape would be noticed as soon as the ceremony was due to begin, but she couldn't go back. Not after what she had discovered, not after seeing the true face of the man she was about to marry. As the hours passed, the landscape around them became wilder and wilder. The fields of tall grass gave way to rock formations and twisted bushes. Her dress, once a symbol of her hopes for a prosperous future, had now become a prison of fabric and lace that made every step difficult. As the sun began to set painting, the sky in shades of red and purple, Abigail realized her terrible mistake. In her haste to escape, she hadn't brought any water or provisions. The heat and fatigue were taking their toll, and her vision was becoming increasingly blurred. Miles away, Swift Arrow was riding on his daily round of his people's hunting grounds. The young Crow warrior had learned from an early age to read the signs of the land, and something in the air that afternoon unsettled him. The birds flew in strange patterns, and the wind carried an omen that he couldn't decipher. That's when he spotted a white figure staggering against the reddish horizon. At first glance, he thought it was a spirit, one of the old stories the elders told about souls lost in the desert. But as he got closer, he realized it was a white woman dressed like a bride, practically fainting from exhaustion. Swift Arrow dismounted, gracefully, her movements as silent as those of a predator. Years of conflict between his people and the settlers had taught him to be cautious, but something about that woman, perhaps her absolute vulnerability or the determination that had brought her so far, touched him deeply. "Water," Abigail murmured as she saw the figure approaching, her voice no more than a hoarse whisper. Her legs finally gave way, and she fell to her knees on the red earth. Her last sight before losing consciousness was of deep, dark eyes that seemed to see into her soul. Swift Arrow caught the woman in his arms before she hit the ground. Despite his natural distrust of white people, he couldn't let her die there. The spirits had put this woman in his path for a reason, and he respected the ways of the Great Spirit too much to ignore such a sign. Carefully, he placed her on his horse and rode behind her, supporting her unconscious body. Her tribe's camp was not far away, and her grandmother, Medicine Woman, would know how to take care of her. As he rode back, Swift Arrow couldn't help but notice how fate had strange ways of intertwining lives. On the horizon, clouds of dust were rising. Crawford had gathered his men as soon as he had discovered his fiancée's escape. The cattle baron couldn't allow her to reveal his secrets, to expose his carefully laid plans to take over the Crow lands and expand his empire. "Find her," he ordered his henchmen, his normally controlled face contorted with rage. "Bring her back alive, if possible." The last part had been said with a cold smile that made even his toughest men wince. In the Crow village medicine, Woman was preparing her herbs and traditional medicines, sensing in the air that important changes were coming. The old woman had lived long enough to recognize when the spirits began to weave new destinies, and something told her that the arrival of this white woman would change the course of many lives. Swift Arrow rode against time, aware that soon Crawford's men would start looking for her. He knew all too well the greed and cruelty of the whites who coveted his people's land. But something about this woman was different. She hadn't fled towards civilization, but into the heart of the wilderness, as if the land itself was calling her. As the sun disappeared completely over the horizon, leaving only a purple trail in the sky, Swift Arrow made a silent promise to the spirits. He would protect this woman, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because something in his heart told him that his destiny and hers were now inexorably linked. The first chapter of their lives together was just beginning, written on the red sands of Montana, under a sky that held ancient secrets and promises of change. The coming war cast its shadow over them all, but for now, there was only the sound of the horses' hooves against the earth, and the soft breathing of a woman who carried with her the power to change the destiny of two peoples. Consciousness slowly returned to Abigail like water seeping through cracks in a rock. Her eyes opened to a ceiling made of stretched skins, supported by long wooden poles. The air inside the teepee was scented with medicinal herbs and sage smoke, so different from the heavy aroma of French cologne that permeated Crawford's mansion. Medicine Woman watched attentively as the young woman awoke. The old woman had spent the night preparing infusions and poultices, her wrinkled hands working with the precision of decades of experience. Next to her, Swift Arrow remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on the woman he had brought from the desert. "You are safe here, daughter of the white people." Medicine Woman spoke in English, her voice carrying the weight of wisdom. "The spirits guided my grandson to you for a reason." Abigail tried to sit up, but her body protested with pains she didn't know existed. How long have I been unconscious?" Her voice came out hoarse, her throat still dry despite the care she had received. "2 suns have set since Swift Arrow brought you here," replied the old woman, offering her a bowl of herbal tea. "Drink it. It will help you regain your strength." As Abigail sipped the bitter but comforting liquid, her mind began to process her situation. She was in a Crow camp among the very people Crawford planned to destroy. The irony of his refuge did not escape him. Swift Arrow, who had remained silent until then, approached. "Crawford's men are looking for you," he said, his deep voice carrying a slight accent. "They came to the border of our lands, but they didn't dare enter. Not yet." Fear gripped Abigail's heart again. "You don't understand. He won't give up. What I've discovered." She hesitated, looking around nervously. "The information I have could prevent a war, but it could also kill us all." Medicine Woman exchanged a meaningful glance with her grandson. "The signs were right then," she muttered. "Spirits don't bring coincidences, only purpose." At that moment, warning cries echoed through the camp. Swift Arrow quickly left the teepee, returning moments later. "White knights, many of them on the western border. They're not Crawford's men, they're soldiers from the fort." Abigail's heart raced. The soldiers meant that Crawford was using his influence with the army, probably fueling already existing tensions with lies about Indian attacks. "I have to leave," she said, trying to get up. "I'm putting you all in danger." Medicine Woman stopped her with surprising strength for someone her age. "The danger is already here, child. It was here before you arrived. Now, perhaps we have a chance to change it." Swift Arrow agreed. "My grandmother is right. If what you know can prevent a war, then you belong here. Our people have protected these lands for generations. We can protect you, too." Abigail looked at him, noticing for the first time the nobility in his bearing, the quiet strength in his eyes. This was not the savage that Crawford and his associates described in their prejudiced meetings. He was a warrior, yes, but also a protector, a man of honor. Throughout the day, more news reached the camp. Crawford had convinced the authorities that Abigail had been kidnapped by the Crow, using her disappearance as a pretext to increase pressure on the tribe. The lie was as elaborate as it was cruel, typical of the man she had almost betrothed. In the evening, while the tribal council met to discuss the situation, Abigail stayed in Medicine Woman's teepee, learning about the medicinal herbs and customs of her people. The old woman seemed determined to treat her not as a fugitive, but as an apprentice. "Each plant has a spirit," explained Medicine Woman, showing her different herbs. "Just as each person has a path. Sometimes we need to get lost to find the right path." Swift Arrow came in and out of the tipi, bringing news and food, always keeping a protective eye on Abigail. There was something about his presence that made her feel safe despite the desperate situation. "The council has decided," he finally announced. "You will be under our protection. But we need to know exactly what you found out about Crawford. What is he planning?" Abigail took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The words she'd heard in that office, the documents she'd glimpsed, everything pointed to a bigger conspiracy than she'd imagined. Crawford wasn't alone. There were other farmers, politicians, and even army officers involved. "It's more than just land," she began. "They discovered gold in the mountains west of here. Crawford has forged documents claiming mineral rights, but he needs the Crow out of the way before anyone discovers the truth. The war he wants to provoke is just an excuse for a planned massacre." The silence that followed his words was as heavy as a storm about to break. Swift Arrow and Medicine Woman exchanged grave glances, recognizing the magnitude of the situation. "Tomorrow," said Swift Arrow finally, "you will tell the council everything. Every detail could be important in saving our people." That night, as the stars shone over the camp, Abigail reflected on the twists and turns her life had taken. Just 3 days ago, she was about to marry one of the most powerful men in the territory. Now she was taking refuge among those who were supposed to be her enemies, but who had shown more humanity than all the civilized society she had left behind. Outside, the teepee Swift Arrow stood guard, his silhouette jagged against the night sky. Abigail watched him through the tent entrance, noticing how her heart raced every time their gazes met. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, but also as inevitable as the sunrise. The coming war wasn't just about land or gold, it was a clash between two worlds, two ways of looking at life. And Abigail, who now found herself between these worlds, knew that her next decisions could determine not only her fate, but that of all those who had risked their lives to protect her. The tribal council met at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight were still struggling to break through the mist that covered the Crow camp. Abigail, now dressed in clothes borrowed from the women of the tribe, sat in the circle of elders, her presence an anomaly that did not go unnoticed. Swift Arrow stood beside her, serving as translator and protector. "Tell us everything," said Running Bear, the head of the council, his deep voice carrying the weight of many battles. "What exactly did you find out about Crawford and his plans?" Abigail took a deep breath, her fingers nervously tightening the fabric of her skirt. "On the morning of the wedding, I was looking for Crawford to discuss some details of the ceremony. That's when I heard voices coming from his office, him and other men discussing maps and documents. The words flowed now like a dammed river, finally finding its course. She described the documents she had glimpsed, the whispered conversations about gold veins discovered in the Crow's sacred mountains, the plans to provoke conflicts that would justify military intervention. "There's a whole network of conspirators," she continued. "Politicians and Helena Army officers at Fort Kearney, other ranchers in the area. Crawford is just the visible face of something much bigger. Swift Arrow translated her words, and a worried murmur went around the circle. Medicine Woman, who had remained silent until then, raised her wrinkled voice. The signs in the stars spoke of great changes. Now I understand that they spoke of war and betrayal. But also of hope, added Running Bear, his eyes fixed on Abigail. You risked your life to warn us. Why? The question took Abigail by surprise. For a moment, she hesitated, aware of the stares that surrounded her, especially Swift Arrow's. Because it's the right thing to do, she finally answered. Because I can't stand by while innocent people are slaughtered for greed. The council deliberated for hours. Abigail watched in fascination, as decisions were made not by imposition but by consensus, each voice having its moment to be heard. It was so different from the farmers' meetings where Crawford and his associates dictated their wills without regard for others. Meanwhile, Swift Arrow shared his own findings. The soldiers on the western border have increased in number. They're building a new outpost supposedly to protect the settlers. Preparing the ground for the conflict they plan to start, Abigail added. Crawford always said he only needed a pretext, a single incident, to convince the authorities to act against the Crow. The tension in the air was palpable when Running Bear finally announced the council's decision. We will send messengers to the other tribes. The Blackfeet and Cheyenne need to know about the white men's plans. In the meantime, our guest will be under our protection. Medicine Woman approached Abigail after the meeting. Come, daughter. There is much you need to learn about our customs. Knowledge is protection. The following days established a new routine for Abigail. Her mornings were spent with Medicine Woman learning about medicinal herbs and Crow traditions. Afternoons were spent helping with camp chores, slowly gaining the trust of the community. Swift Arrow was always nearby, their gazes meeting with increasing frequency. He began to teach her to ride in the Crow way, his strong hands guiding her with a gentleness that contrasted with his warlike appearance. You ride like you're trying to master the horse, he explained during one of these lessons. You need to learn to be one with it, like the wind is one with the prairie grass. Abigail discovered that there was much more to learn than she had first imagined. Each day brought new revelations about a people the whites considered savages, but whose culture was rich in wisdom and traditions. One afternoon, while gathering medicinal herbs in the hills near the camp, Swift Arrow and Abigail had a moment of closeness that neither of them had expected. He was helping her identify a specific plant when their fingers touched, sending an electric current through both their bodies. Do your people have a name for this? She asked softly, her heart racing. For when two people feel something they shouldn't feel. Swift Arrow looked at her longingly before answering. We call it fate. Spirits don't make mistakes when they join paths. The moment was interrupted by a warning signal from the camp. Horsemen were approaching, not soldiers this time, but Crawford's men. They had ventured deeper into Crow territory than ever before. They won't give up, said Abigail, fear tightening her chest again. Crawford knows that, as long as I'm alive, his plans are at risk. Swift Arrow led her quickly back to the camp along a hidden path. Then we'll make sure you stay alive, he replied with fierce determination. Not just for you, but for all of us. That night, as the camp prepared for possible conflicts, Abigail realized that her life had changed irrevocably. She was no longer just a runaway bride. She had become part of something bigger, a crucial piece in a conflict that could determine the future of an entire people. In her teepee, Medicine Woman prepared amulets of protection, her wrinkled hands working with purpose as she hummed ancient sacred songs. The spirits are restless, she murmured. "Great changes are coming, and we will all have to choose which side to stand on." Abigail knew she had already made her choice. Looking at Swift Arrow through the flames of the central campfire, she understood that her heart had already chosen too, even if her mind still fought against this truth. The tension in the Crow camp increased every day, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Crawford's men had become bolder in their incursions, testing the limits of tribal territory, while the fort's soldiers established new surveillance posts ever closer. Abigail watched these changes with growing concern as she helped medicine woman prepare healing ointments. Her hands were already moving more confidently among the herbs, and the words in the Crow language were beginning to make sense to her ears. It was as if each day spent with the tribe changed her a little more, erasing the boundaries between the worlds that had once seemed so defined. "The heart knows no boundaries," Medicine Woman said one morning, surprising Abigail with her insight. "I see how you look at my grandson, and how he looks at you." Abigail blushed intensely, her hands trembling slightly as they macerated the herbs. "That would be impossible," she replied softly. "Our worlds are too different." The old woman smiled, her wrinkles deepening like gullies on her wise face. "The spirits don't care about the differences that men create. They only see souls." That afternoon, Swift Arrow asked Abigail to accompany him on a ride to check for signs of movement on the borders of the territory. She readily agreed now, more confident in her ability to ride the Crow way. As they rode side by side, the silence between them was comfortable, laden with unspoken meanings. "Crawford has sent a message to the council." Swift Arrow, finally, broke the silence. "He offers peace in exchange for you." Abigail's heart raced. "You can't trust him. His promises are as empty as the desert wind." "The council knows that," he replied, his eyes meeting hers, "but some argue that one life is not worth the risk of war for the whole tribe." "I should leave," she said, although the words hurt her heart. "I can't be responsible for the destruction of your people." Swift Arrow pulled on his horse's reins, forcing them both to stop. His gaze was intense as he turned to her. "You're already part of our people, Abigail. Don't you see that your departure wouldn't save us? It would only hasten Crawford's plans." At that moment, a distant sound caught her attention. Swift Arrow raised her hand, signaling for silence, her heightened senses picking up on something Abigail couldn't yet perceive. Within seconds, the sound of hooves became clearer. Riders were approaching. "Quickly," he whispered, guiding her to a nearby cluster of rocks. They had barely hidden when a group of Crawford's men galloped past, their weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. Abigail and Swift Arrow stood motionless, their bodies close together in the tight space between the rocks. She could feel his warmth, hear his controlled breathing, sense every tense muscle ready to protect her if necessary. The moment seemed suspended in time, charged with danger and something else, something that made her heart beat faster for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. When the riders finally pulled away, neither of them moved. Immediately, Swift Arrow looked at her, his dark eyes filled with restrained emotion. "There are many ways to lose someone," he said softly. "Some are worse than death." Before Abigail could reply, he leaned over and kissed her. It was a gentle, almost hesitant kiss, so different from the strength he usually showed. For a moment, all the barriers between their worlds seemed to melt like snow under the desert sun. When they parted, they both knew that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just allies united against a common enemy. They were two souls who had found in each other something that transcended the differences of their origins. "That complicates everything," whispered Abigail, although her heart sang with joy. "Life was already complicated," he replied with a slight smile. "Now we just have one more reason to fight." The return to the camp was silent, but full of new meanings. Medicine Woman watched them arrive with her wise eyes, a small smile on her wrinkled lips, indicating that she had known what had happened even before they dismounted. That night, during the council, Swift Arrow had passionately defended Abigail's staying with the tribe, not just as a source of information about Crawford, but as someone who had proven her loyalty and worth. Her words now carried a different weight, born not only of honor, but also of love. Running Bear, having heard all the arguments, stood up to announce his decision. "The white woman will stay," he declared with authority. "Not because we need her, but because she has chosen to be with us. And we Crow honor those who choose our path with a true heart." As the stars rose in the night sky, Abigail sat by the central fire watching the flames dance. Swift Arrow joined her, keeping a respectful distance, but his presence was like a warm blanket on a cold night. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. "Now," he replied, "we prepare for the storm that is coming. Crawford won't give up easily, and when he finds out about us—" He left the sentence incomplete, but they both understood the implications. Medicine Woman, who was passing by, stopped to share her wisdom. "Sometimes love is the most powerful weapon we have. It gives us the strength to face the impossible and the courage to change destinies." The old woman's words echoed in the night, carrying with them a promise and a warning. The coming war was no longer just about land or gold. It was about something much more precious, the right to love freely beyond the borders that men had created. Dawn brought with it a cold wind from the mountains, carrying not only the scent of distant pines, but also the harbinger of inevitable change. Abigail awoke in her teepee to the sound of agitated voices outside. More messengers had arrived during the night, bringing disturbing news from other territories. Swift Arrow found her while she was helping Medicine Woman with breakfast. Her normally serene face was marked by concern. "The Blackfeet have confirmed our suspicions," he said quietly. "Crawford is not alone. Other ranches are also arming themselves, hiring men. They're planning a coordinated attack." Medicine Woman listened in silence, her wrinkled hands continuing to work the herbs as she absorbed the information. "The Piabi signs in the stars spoke the truth," she murmured. "Darkness is approaching from all directions." The tribal council met urgently at midday. Abigail, now accepted as part of the community, sat next to Swift Arrow, while the leaders discussed the new information. Running Bear chaired the meeting with the gravity of one who carries the weight of many lives on his shoulders. "The whites speak with divided tongues," said Black Wolf, one of the most respected warriors. "They offer peace with one hand, while hiding knives in the other. We must strike first, before it's too late." A murmur of agreement went around the circle, but Swift Arrow stood up to speak. "A hasty attack is exactly what Crawford wants. It would give him the justification he's looking for to start his war." "So we should sit back and wait while they surround our lands?" asked another warrior, his voice laced with bitterness. That's when Abigail, gathering all her courage, asked for permission to speak. Running Bear nodded, and silence fell over the council. "There's something I haven't told you before," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Among the documents I saw in Crawford's office, there were letters correspondence with important people in Washington. He has no official authorization for his actions. If we could get proof of his plans, we could expose him before the violence starts." Swift Arrow translated his words, and a new wave of discussions began. The idea of using white people's own laws against them was new and intriguing to many of those present. "How would we get that evidence?" asked Running Bear, his eyes fixed on Abigail. "The documents are still at Crawford's ranch," she replied. "In his office in a safe. I know the combination. It used to be the date of our wedding." The silence that followed her statement was as heavy as thunder before a storm. Swift Arrow looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing what she was about to suggest. "No," he said firmly. "It's suicide to go back there." But Abigail stood her ground. "It's our best chance. Crawford will be in Helena in the next few days for a meeting with other ranchers. The ranch will be on reduced security." Medicine Woman, who until then had watched in silence, raised her wrinkled voice. "The spirits don't show us paths without danger, only paths with purpose. The girl speaks with wisdom." After hours of debate, a plan began to take shape. Swift Arrow, however, reluctantly knew it was the best option they had. He insisted on leading the mission himself, choosing only his most skilled warriors to accompany them. That night, as the camp prepared for bed, Abigail and Swift Arrow walked to a high point from where they could see the distant lights of Crawford's ranch. The full moon bathed the landscape in silver, turning the desert into a sea frozen in time. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Abigail entwined her fingers in his, finding strength in his touch. "There's been no turning back since the moment I fled that altar. My path now lies with you, with your people." Swift Arrow pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "Our people," he corrected softly. "You're one of us now, even if some don't see it yet." The night wind carried the distant howl of a coyote, reminding them of the dangers that surrounded them. But in that moment, embraced under the stars, they found peace in the certainty of their love, even if the future was uncertain. Medicine Woman found them like this when she came to bring them amulets of protection that she had prepared. "Love is like water in the desert," she said, handing over the small leather bags. "Precious and rare, but with the power to make the impossible blossom." Preparations for the mission continued for the next 2 days. Abigail spent hours drawing detailed maps of the ranch, marking every entrance, every guard point. Swift Arrow memorized every detail, planning escape routes and rendezvous points. "If anything goes wrong," he said as they went over the plan, "one last time. Promise you'll run without looking back." Abigail touched his face gently. "I can't promise that. Not when my heart would be left behind with you." His answer was a deep kiss, full of unspoken promises and unexpressed fears. When they parted, they both knew that their lives had become irreversibly intertwined, like two rivers meeting to form a stronger current. The day of their departure dawned clear and cold. Medicine Woman blessed each of the warriors with sacred, sage smoke, her ancient prayers mingling with the morning wind. When it was Abigail's turn, the old woman held her for a longer moment. "You carry more than secrets in your heart now, child," she whispered with an enigmatic smile. "The spirits have already woven your destiny with that of our people." As they mounted their horses preparing to leave, Abigail took one last look at the camp that had become her home. The rising sun painted the teepees in shades of gold and red, like a promise that no matter what happened, she would always have a place to return to. Swift Arrow gave the signal, and the small group set off silently, merging into the early morning shadows. The mission that could change everyone's destiny had begun, carrying with it the hopes of two peoples and the love that defied all borders. The mission to Crawford's ranch began before dawn, with the group moving like shadows across the still, sleeping landscape. Swift Arrow led the way with Abigail right behind him and 4 hand-picked Crow warriors completing the team. The plan was simple in theory, but everyone knew that the dangers were manifold and unpredictable. "The safe is on the wall behind the desk," whispered Abigail as they approached the perimeter of the ranch. "Crawford keeps a 3-man rotation on the night guard, but with him in Helena, they've probably cut that down to 2. Swift Arrow nodded his watchful eyes, scanning the property that emerged from the darkness. The Crawford Ranch was an imposing structure, a 2-story mansion that stood out in the landscape like a monument to its owner's greed. Around it, several smaller buildings, stables, workers' quarters, and warehouses formed a small complex. "Running Horse and Black Wolf, you watch the southern perimeter," ordered Swift Arrow in a low voice. "White Deer and Silent step the north. Any sign of trouble, use the coyote call as an alert." The warriors parted silently, leaving Swift Arrow and Abigail to approach the main house. Her heart beat so loudly that it seemed as if everyone within a kilometer radius could hear it. The memories of her last time in that place, dressed as a bride and fleeing in panic, threatened to paralyze her movements. As if sensing her fear, Swift Arrow lightly touched her arm. "You're not alone now," he murmured. "We're in this together." They waited in the shadows, watching the guards' movements. As Abigail had predicted, only 2 men were doing the rounds, one of them clearly bored, and the other more interested in the bottle in his pocket than in effective surveillance. Using the skills that had made the Crow warriors feared and respected, Swift Arrow guided them through the estate's blind spots. Abigail was surprised at her own ability to move silently. Weeks of living with the tribe had taught her more than she realized. The entrance was easier than they had expected. Abigail knew of a window on the 2nd floor that never closed properly, a defect Crawford had always promised to fix, but never did. Carefully, they sneaked into the dark house. The office was at the end of the main corridor, a room that Abigail had always found oppressive, even during the day. At night, with only moonlight coming through the windows, it seemed even more threatening. The smell of leather tobacco and lamp oil lingered in the air, as if Crawford were still there. "The safe," she whispered, moving towards the wall behind the massive desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the combination dial. 629. A soft click indicated that the combination was correct. Swift Arrow kept watch on the door as she opened the safe, searching through the documents. There were piles of papers, land contracts, financial records. "Here," she whispered urgently, pulling out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. "These are the correspondence with Washington and—" Wait. Her eyes widened as she found another document. "This is new. These are orders for the army already signed, just waiting for a date to be filled." Crawford planned to use any incident as justification for a large-scale attack. A creak in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps were approaching, more than one set of them. Swift Arrow moved silently into the shadows near the door, while Abigail quickly stowed the documents in her leather bag. "I'm sure I heard something down here." A male voice reached them, followed by another that made Abigail's blood run cold. "Check everything. Mr. Crawford said she might try to come back." It was Joseph Miller, the ranch foreman and Crawford's right-hand man. His presence wasn't in the calculations. He was supposed to be in Helena with his boss. Swift Arrow made a silent gesture to Abigail, indicating the window. It was their only escape route, but they would have to be quick. The footsteps were getting closer. With her heart in her throat, Abigail followed Swift Arrow to the window. He opened it with superhuman care, avoiding any noise. The sound of voices was now practically at the office door. Swift Arrow got out first, turning to help her. Abigail was almost across the parapet when the door opened. The light of a lamp illuminated the office, and for a terrible moment, her eyes met Miller's. "There!" The foreman's shout broke the silence of the night. "It's Miss Foster! Catch her!" Swift Arrow pulled Abigail out just as the first shot exploded, shattering the glass of the window above them. The sound of the alarm began to echo through the property, and lights began to turn on everywhere. "Run!" ordered Swift Arrow, pushing her towards the shadows as he drew his gun. The sound of the coyote's call cut through the night. His warriors were already on the move to cover his escape. More shots echoed through the night as they zigzagged across the yard. Abigail could hear the shouts of Crawford's men and the sound of horses being hastily prepared. Her heart felt like it was about to explode, but she didn't dare slow down. They reached the tree line just as the first riders took off in pursuit. White Deer and Silent Step emerged from the shadows, with their horses allowing them to mount quickly. Running Horse and Black Wolf appeared soon after, providing cover with precise arrows that forced the pursuers to retreat. "The papers?" asked Swift Arrow as they galloped through the night. "I got them all," replied Abigail, clutching her leather bag to her chest. "But Miller saw us. He's going to warn Crawford immediately. Then our war begins sooner than we expected," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of this realization. They rode non-stop until sunrise, taking indirect routes to throw off possible pursuers. When they finally paused to rest, the horses, Abigail noticed that her hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline and the realization of what they had accomplished. "There's no turning back now," she said, looking at Swift Arrow. He pulled her close, his strong arms offering comfort and protection. "There never was," he replied softly. "From the moment you chose truth over convenience, your path was already set." The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky with colors reminiscent of fire and blood. It was a new day, but also the start of a battle that would forever change the fate of everyone involved. With the stolen documents in her possession and Swift Arrow's love in her heart, Abigail knew she would weather any storm that came her way. The return to Camp Crow was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Medicine Woman was waiting at the entrance to the camp as if she had foreseen the exact moment of her arrival. Her ancient eyes scanned each member of the group for injuries, lingering a moment longer on Abigail and Swift Arrow. "The spirits were restless tonight," said the old woman as she led them to the council teepee. "Now I understand why." Running Bear had already summoned the tribal leaders, and the circle quickly formed around the central fire. Abigail, still shaking from the night's ride, took the documents out of her leather bag. Swift Arrow stood beside her, his presence an anchor amidst the turmoil of emotions. "These papers prove everything," she explained, her voice gaining strength as she presented the evidence. "Crawford and his associates planned to use fabricated conflicts to justify a massive attack. The orders are already signed, all that's missing is the date." Black Wolf examined the letters skeptically. "Words on white paper. Why should we trust them?" "Because these words could save lives," Swift Arrow replied. "If we can get this evidence to the right authorities in Washington, we can expose Crawford before he starts his war." A murmur went around the circle, interrupted by White Deer's abrupt arrival. "Horsemen approaching from the south," he announced, panting. "Lots of them. Crawford has returned from Helena ahead of schedule." The council erupted into activity. Running Bear began distributing orders, organizing warriors for defense, and sending the youngest and oldest to more protected positions in the hills. Medicine Woman hurried to gather her healing herbs, preparing for what was to come. "They won't. Wait until dawn," said Swift Arrow, her eyes meeting Abigail's. "Miller must have sent an urgent messenger to Helena. Crawford knows we have evidence against him now." Abigail felt the weight of guilt in her chest. "This is my fault. I brought this war upon you." "No!" Medicine Woman interrupted, firmly approaching with a small leather parcel. "The war was already coming. You gave us a chance to fight with honor, not just survive." The old woman handed the package to Abigail. Inside was a tribal amulet and a pistol. "For protection," she explained, "both body and spirit." The sound of thundering hooves in the distance grew louder by the moment. Swift Arrow led Abigail to a high point from where they could see Crawford's men approaching. Torches dotted the darkness like fallen stars, revealing an alarming number of riders. "They want to force us to fight in the dark," observed Swift Arrow. "They think they'll have an advantage." Abigail held up her hand. "They don't know the Crow like I did. They don't know what you're capable of." A subtle smile touched Swift Arrow's lips. "They don't know you either, my love. The woman who stood up to her own people for justice." The first shot cut through the night like thunder, followed by war cries that mixed white and Crow voices. The battle had begun, and with it the chance to change the fate of two cultures. Crawford personally led the attack, his voice hoarse, with hatred echoing through the valley. "Find the girl, burn everything, if you have to." The Crow warriors moved like shadows among the trees and rocks, their arrows finding targets with deadly precision. Years of hunting and survival had taught them to use the darkness as an ally, turning the attackers' supposed advantage into their own trap. Abigail and Swift Arrow separated from the others, carrying with them the documents that could change everything. Their plan was simple. While the battle distracted Crawford and his men, they would try to reach the nearest fort, where an officer friend of Running Bear, one of the few white men who respected native rights, could help them send the evidence to Washington. But Crawford seemed to have foreseen this possibility. A group of his men came out of nowhere, cutting off their escape route. Swift Arrow pushed Abigail behind a rock formation just as the bullets began to fly. "We need to go back," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "There's no going back," she replied, pulling out the pistol Medicine Woman had given her. "There's only the road ahead." As if to emphasize her words, a bullet hit the rock next to her head, sending shards of stone in all directions. Swift Arrow responded with sharp arrows, and two of the attackers fell from their horses. The sky began to lighten on the horizon, painting the battlefield in bloody shades of dawn. Smoke rose from various parts of the camp where Crawford's men had managed to set fire, but the Crow resisted fiercely, protecting their home with ancestral determination. "Abigail." Crawford's voice sounded dangerously close. "Do you really think you can escape? That you can change anything? This territory will be mine, with or without your precious documents." Swift Arrow and Abigail exchanged glances. At that moment, something passed between them, a mutual understanding, a shared decision. They weren't just fighting for their lives or for justice. They were fighting for a future in which different peoples could coexist, in which love could flourish beyond the barriers of prejudice. "Together," she whispered, holding her pistol tightly. "Always," he replied, a promise in his dark eyes. The rising sun illuminated the valley, revealing the full extent of the battle that continued to roar around them. Somewhere nearby, Medicine Woman chanted ancient songs of protection, her voice rising above the chaos as a reminder of the power of faith and tradition. The war for the heart of Montana had now truly begun, and its outcome would hinge not only on the strength of arms, but on the courage of those who dared to defy the conventions of their time, for something greater than themselves. Sunrise revealed the full extent of the chaos that had taken hold in the Crow camp. Smoke rose in black spirals from several burning tents, while the sound of gunfire and war cries continued to echo through the valley. Abigail and Swift Arrow moved like shadows between the rocks, the precious documents held close to her chest. "We need to get to the eastern pass," whispered Swift Arrow, her dark eyes scanning the terrain. "There's an old trail that the whites don't know about. We can use it to reach the fort." A shot ricocheted off a nearby rock, making Abigail cringe. Crawford had divided his men into smaller groups, methodically surrounding the camp. His voice could still be heard giving orders with a calculated coldness that made her blood run cold. "You two check those rocks. Johnson, take your men around the north flank. Don't let any savages escape. And bring back my runaway bride alive." Medicine Woman suddenly appeared beside them, as if she had materialized from the shadows themselves. In her hands, she carried a small leather pouch. "The spirits have shown me another way," she said urgently. "There is a sacred cave used by our people for generations. Crawford and his men will never find it." "We can't hide," Abigail protested. "We need to get this evidence to the fort, or all this sacrifice will have been for nothing." The old woman smiled, her eyes shining with ancient wisdom. "Who said anything about hiding? The cave has an exit on the other side of the mountain. It's a dangerous path, but the spirits will guide you." Swift Arrow exchanged a meaningful glance with her grandmother. "The sacred tunnels no white man has ever." "She's not just a white girl anymore," interrupted Medicine Woman, placing the bag in Abigail's hands. "She's family now. The spirits have accepted her just as her heart has accepted our people." More shots echoed now closer. Running Bear and a group of warriors appeared briefly on top of a nearby hill, attracting the attention of the attackers to provide cover for the others. The tribal chief had organized a fierce defense, but Abigail knew they couldn't hold out forever against Crawford's superior weapons. This way, guided Medicine Woman, leading them through a series of rock formations that looked identical to the untrained eye. The path will open only to those who know its secrets. Abigail followed closely, aware that each step could be the difference between life and death. Swift Arrow covered the rear, his bow always ready. The sound of battle began to fade as they moved deeper into the Crow's sacred territory. The entrance to the cave was so well camouflaged that Abigail only noticed it when Medicine Woman passed. Straight through what appeared to be a solid wall of rock. It was a narrow crevice, partially covered by vegetation, and shaded in such a way that it was practically invisible. "The tunnels are ancient," explained Medicine Woman as she lit a torch. "Our ancestors used them for sacred ceremonies, and in times of war like this, always follow the marks of the wind spirits. They will show you the way." Swift Arrow examined the walls of the cave where tribal symbols had been painted for generations. "The marks will take us to the other side of the mountain. From there, we can reach the fort before nightfall." A distant rumble made the mountain itself shake. Crawford had started using dynamite to dislodge the Crow warriors from their defensive positions. The desperation in their pursuit was becoming more and more evident. "Go," urged Medicine Woman. "I will return to help our people. The spirits will protect your journey." Before they left, the old woman pulled Abigail into a tight embrace. "You carry more than papers now, child," she whispered. "You carry hope and new life." Abigail felt her heart skip a beat, understanding the meaning of the shaman's words. Her hand instinctively touched her belly, and unexpected tears welled up in her eyes. Swift Arrow, who hadn't heard her grandmother's whisper, picked up the torch. "We need to move quickly. The vibrations from the dynamite could destabilize some tunnels." They advanced through the darkness guided by the flickering light of the torch and the ancient symbols on the walls. The air was thick with history, as if the spirits of the Crow ancestors really were watching them. Each distant explosion sent cascades of dust from the ceiling, reminding them of the constant danger. "Swift Arrow," Abigail called softly after a while. "Your grandmother. She told me something. Something important." He stopped, turning to her. In the torchlight, his eyes shone with an intensity that made her heart race. "What is it?" She hesitated, her hand again, finding her belly. "We are no longer alone on this journey." For a moment, Swift Arrow stood motionless, processing the meaning of his words. Then a slow, amazed smile lit up his face. He pulled her close, one hand gently touching her still flat belly. "The spirits have truly woven our destinies together," he murmured, his voice tinged with emotion. "Now, more than ever, we need to survive. Not just for us or for our people, but for the future that grows inside you." A new bang closer this. Time brought them back to the reality of their situation. They had to keep moving. The baby Abigail was carrying represented more than just the union of two lovers. It was a symbol of hope, a promise that two worlds could come together in peace and love. "Come on," said Swift Arrow, taking her hand firmly. "Our story has only just begun." Together they moved deeper into the sacred tunnels, carrying with them not only the evidence that could save the Crow people, but also the seed of a future that none of them had imagined possible. Outside, the battle raged on, but here in the depths of the mountain, a new life was blossoming, defying all the barriers the world tried to impose. The sacred tunnel snaked through the bowels of the mountain like an ancient snake, its secrets guarded by generations of Crow ancestors. Abigail and Swift Arrow advanced cautiously, guided by the flickering light of the torch and the mystical symbols on the walls. The knowledge that she carried a new life within her gave Abigail both strength and apprehension. Every step now had an even deeper meaning. The explosions continued on the surface, sending tremors through the rock that made small cascades of stones fall from the ceiling. Swift Arrow kept a protective arm around Abigail as they navigated through increasingly narrow passages. "The symbols are changing," he observed, raising the torch to better illuminate the walls. "We're coming to the most sacred part of the tunnel. My grandmother used to say that the spirits speak loudest here." As if to confirm his words, a cold and inexplicable draft momentarily extinguished the torch, leaving them in complete darkness. Abigail felt her heart racing, but not from fear. It was a different sensation, as if something or someone was watching them benevolently. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her hand finding Swift Arrow's in the dark. "The ancestors," he replied softly, relighting the torch. "They guide us." When the light returned, Abigail realized they were in a circular chamber larger than the previous passages. The walls were covered in elaborate paintings, telling the ancient stories of the Crow people, battle ceremonies, spiritual visions. In the center, a small, natural, well-held crystalline water that seemed to glow with a light of its own. "It's sacred water," explained Swift Arrow, kneeling beside the well. "They say that those who drink from it receive the blessing of the spirits." Abigail joined him, her fingers gently touching the surface of the water. Her rippling reflection showed not only her face, but also shadows of other faces, like memories of everyone who had been there before. A new tremor, stronger than the previous ones, shook the chamber. Larger pieces of rock began to fall, and the sound of cracks forming echoed ominously. "Crawford must have found more dynamite," said Abigail, standing up quickly. "We need to keep going." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency, but now there was something different in the air, an ancient energy that seemed to guide them through the maze of tunnels. The markings on the walls became clearer, almost luminescent, showing the way like an underground star trail. "Look!" pointed out Swift Arrow after a few more minutes of walking. Natural light. A shaft of light seeped through a distant opening, promising the exit they were looking for. But before they could reach it, a deafening crash shook the entire mountain. Abigail was thrown against the wall, instinctively protecting her belly. Swift Arrow supported her, but they both watched in horror as part of the tunnel behind them collapsed. "Crawford must have found another way in," he said, his voice tense. "He's trying to bury us alive." Panic threatened to take hold of Abigail, but she pushed it away with fierce determination. She was no longer fighting just for herself or the Crow people. She was fighting for the future that was growing inside her, a promise of union between two worlds. "How far is it to the exit?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not much, but—" Swift Arrow hesitated, looking up at the ceiling that continued to drop stones. "The path isn't direct. There's one last ordeal." He led her down a side passage that opened into a deep chasm. An ancient rope and wooden bridge, clearly maintained over generations, was the only way across. Below, the darkness seemed infinite. "The spirits test those who seek passage," said Swift Arrow. "We must trust." More explosions shook the mountain. The bridge swayed dangerously, some of its planks already loose from time and tremors. There was no choice; they had to cross before the entire tunnel system collapsed. Swift Arrow went first, testing each step carefully. Abigail followed her hands, squeezing the side ropes hard enough to leave marks. Each step was an eternity each. Creak of the ancient wood made her heart leap. They were halfway across when a particularly loud explosion reverberated through the cave. One of the bridge's main ropes snapped, beginning to unravel. "Run!" shouted Swift Arrow, holding out her hand to Abigail. She ran, ignoring the violent rocking of the bridge, focusing only on the outstretched hand of her lover. The planks began to give way beneath her feet, falling one by one into the abyss. With one last desperate impulse, she jumped, being grabbed by Swift Arrow just as the entire bridge collapsed. Gasping, they watched the last pieces of wood and rope disappear into the darkness. There was no turning back, only the path ahead. "Are you all right?" asked Swift Arrow, his hands gently touching her face. "The baby?" "We're fine," she assured him, placing her hand over his. "The spirits protect us, remember." A new tremor reminded them of the urgency of their situation. They continued moving forward faster now, following the natural light that was getting stronger and stronger. The air began to feel fresher, carrying the scent of pine trees and freedom. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing on the opposite side of the mountain. The afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden hues, and in the distance they could see the buildings of the fort that was their destination. "We made it," whispered Abigail, almost in disbelief. But her joy was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. Crawford had predicted their escape route. A group of his men were already waiting for them outside. "Looks like our spirits will have to protect us for a while longer," said Swift Arrow, readying his bow. Abigail drew her pistol, the documents still held close to her chest. "So be it. We haven't come this far to give up now." The sun began its descent over the horizon, painting the sky in fiery colors, a harbinger of the battle that was about to begin. But now, with the knowledge of the new life she carried, and Swift Arrow's love by her side, Abigail was ready to face any challenge. The real ordeal was just beginning. The setting sun transformed the sky into a spectacle of colors as Abigail and Swift Arrow faced their last pursuers. Crawford's men approached in a semicircle, their weapons pointed at the couple standing at the entrance to the sacred cave. "It's over, Miss Foster!" shouted Miller, the foreman, dismounting from his horse. "Mr. Crawford was very clear you're coming back with us dead or alive, and your wild friend." He let the threat hang in the air. Swift Arrow positioned himself slightly ahead of Abigail, his tensed bow aiming for Miller's heart. "My people have protected these lands for generations," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. "No group of thieves will stop us now." Abigail held her pistol tightly, the documents still clutched to her chest. The knowledge that she was carrying a new life inside her only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just a confrontation over land or gold, it was a battle for the future, for a world where her son could live without the shackles of prejudice. The first shot came without warning, ricocheting off the rock next to Swift Arrow's head. Chaos ensued instantly. Abigail and Swift Arrow split up, seeking cover behind rock formations as bullets sliced the air around them. "The fort isn't far away," Swift Arrow shouted between shots, her arrows finding targets with deadly accuracy. "If we can get past them—" A war cry interrupted his words. From the top of the slope, Running Bear emerged with a group of Crow warriors. They had followed the mountain's alternative tunnels, arriving at the crucial moment to help their brothers. "The spirits really do protect us," muttered Abigail, taking advantage of the distraction to hit one of Crawford's men who was trying to flank them. The battle intensified. The Crow, though outnumbered, made up for it with their knowledge of the terrain and their ancient skills. Miller, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, became desperate. "Crawford will kill us if she escapes," he shouted, advancing recklessly towards Abigail's position. Swift Arrow saw the movement and ran to intercept him. The two men collided violently, rolling on the ground in a deadly struggle. Miller was bigger and stronger, but Swift Arrow was fighting with the strength of generations of warriors and the love of his family. Abigail watched helplessly, unable to land a clean shot that didn't risk hitting Swift Arrow. That was when a movement in the corner of her eye caught her eye. More horsemen were approaching, but this time they were soldiers from the fort, led by an officer she recognized from Running Bear's descriptions. "Lower your weapons." Captain James Morrison's voice thundered across the battlefield. "In the name of the United States Army." The fighting gradually ceased, except for Miller and Swift Arrow, who continued their brutal struggle. It took the intervention of two soldiers to separate them. "Captain Morrison." Abigail stepped forward, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I have here evidence of a conspiracy against the Crow people. Maxwell Crawford and his associates were planning a massacre to take these lands illegally." She handed the documents to the officer, who examined them with increasing seriousness. "This is very serious, Ms. Foster. Falsified Army orders, bribery of officers. Crawford will have a lot to explain in Washington." Miller, still restrained by the soldiers, laughed bitterly. "You're all fools. Crawford has powerful friends. This will never get to Washington." "It already has," a new voice joined the conversation. Medicine Woman emerged from the shadows of twilight, followed by a man in a suit Abigail had never seen before. "This is Mr. Howard from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. While you were distracting Crawford and his men, copies of these documents have already been sent to the appropriate authorities." Miller's smile disappeared completely. Swift Arrow, finally, freed by the soldiers, walked over to Abigail, wrapping her protectively in his arms. "Crawford is being arrested as we speak in Helena," continued Mr. Howard, "as are several of his conspirators. This land will remain under the protection of the Crow people as it always should have been." Medicine Woman approached the couple, her ancient eyes shining with wisdom and satisfaction. "The spirits always knew this day would come. That's why they guided you to us, child, so that two worlds could come together in peace and love." As the soldiers handcuffed Miller and Crawford's other men, the sun finally disappeared over the horizon, leaving only a golden glow in the sky. Running Bear approached Captain Morrison and Mr. Howard to discuss the details of the new peace accords. Swift Arrow held Abigail's face between his hands, his eyes overflowing with love and gratitude. "You've changed everything," he said softly. "Not just for our people, but for everyone. Our son will be born into a better world because of your courage." "Our courage," she corrected, placing her hand on her still flat belly. "And he or she will have the best of both worlds, the ancient wisdom of the Crow and the promise of a future where different peoples can live in peace." Medicine Woman joined them, placing her wrinkled hands on Abigail's womb. "This child will be a bridge between worlds, just as you two are." The spirits smiled on this union. In the days that followed, news of Crawford's conspiracy shook the Montana Territory. New agreements were made guaranteeing the Crows' rights to their ancestral lands. Abigail and Swift Arrow were married in a ceremony that united tribal and Western traditions, symbolizing the possibility of a future where different cultures could coexist in harmony. And when months later their son was born under a starry Montana sky, he was greeted with both old Crow songs and Christian prayers. He was the first of a new generation, a generation that carried in its blood the promise that true love knows no boundaries, that courage can change destinies, and that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find your true way home. The Montana desert would continue to hold many secrets, but now it also held a love story that defied preconceptions and changed the course of history. A story that began with a runaway bride and ended with a family that represented the very essence of the American West, wild, free, and endlessly hopeful.